the last chapter, chapter 16. Comyn did his work well, presenting a face of grief-stricken silence to any who appeared before the wicket of the guest-house, refusing to open the door and saying sadly that his master was unable to receive any visitors. News flew so rapidly that, by the time evening came, the whole sacred hill was ready to regard the coming feast as a celebration of the High King's victory over the Roman, who was not, it seemed, for all his magic, powerful enough to resist Leary and his clever druids. Lacrown's face was broad with satisfaction, feeling certain that he had driven Rome for all time out of the land of Erin. In Cahir Crawfin, Leary stretched his long legs out in front of him and sighed, and shouted for Fergus to bring his board. He was more far-seeing than Lucran, and knew that Rome would not be defeated by the killing of one man. He sighed again, but this time a little regretfully. If he had to make peace with Rome, and in the end he thought he had to, and let her bring her faith to Erin, he would as soon have treated with this man as any other. He responded to his quiet and steadfast air, and found him worthy of respect. Well, it was done now. He turned his attention to the men being set along the board by the quivering fingers of Fergus. When Lebron brought the news home in the early evening, Maha rushed at him and clung to his sleeve. "Oh no, my father, oh no, it is not true. Surely it is not true. How did he die?" Lebron looked faintly puzzled. "No one seems to know exactly that, my daughter, but the word has gone round, and any who have tried to visit with him this late day have found the doors barred, and the man who opens the wicket stricken with grief." He turned and rubbed his hands cheerfully before the blazing fire. "Ah," he said, "how welcome. What weather for a festival of spring. Well, Brez, my wife, it will be a great banquet of celebration tonight. The man from the sea is dealt with, and we can all be easy. I tell you, there were many beginning to listen to him after last night." Carefully, he did not look at Maha, determined not to recognize that Patrick's death should be a particular grief to her. Only Brez looked at her and felt her heart wrench with pity as she caught for one moment the despairing and horror-stricken gaze of the tawny eyes before the girl turned and ran, blindly and without a word, seeking the privacy and silence behind her bed curtains in the Grianan. She did not weep, dumb and shattered in her grief for Patrick himself, done to death by these capering druids, for she was quite certain that Lacron was in some way responsible. Overlaying her grief was the panic knowledge that now there would be no one to advise her. With every time that she set eyes on Keon, his fair head rising above those all around him, it grew more difficult to remember that she had promised to give her life to the God of Patrick. She knew now in her heart that no matter what her parents wished, she herself desired this marriage more than anything else on earth, but she could not escape the feeling that it was weakness to turn her back on her first vow, betraying surely the God she had promised herself to. It was not even as if Keon was a Christian, or could ever be one, now that Patrick was dead, for God would die now, as Patrick had done on the hill of Tara, and in all Erin, and there would be no more Christians. She looked at her marriage in despair. It could have been so splendid, but now she felt it would be clouded forever by her broken promise. She was still sitting there when Brez came to her, dressed splendidly for the feast, gleaming with silk and gold. "Ah, my Maha, do not sit there fretting your heart away. There is so much to see tonight. Let me send one of the bondmen to take you up to watch the guests enter my corda for the feast. Would you like that?" "You would like that." She shook her head to all her mother's coaxing and pressed back into the shadows of her bed, and her mother gazed at her despairingly. Alive or dead, this priest of Rome gave them no peace in their house. She had to turn away. There was no time to argue with this girl, or she might delay Lebron at the feast, and woe betide any guest who was not in his or her place to rise in homage to the High King as the High King entered. Maha watched her mother go out, and past her through an opening door she could see the night sky scarlet against the bitter stars, blazing with the firelight and candlelight of the feasting king. The long frenzied hours of preparation were over, and my Corda lay ready for the feast. The guests gathered in ranks outside the 14 open doors, sealed only with a cord of scarlet silk and the tasseled spears of tall warriors, waiting for the blast of trumpets that would sear the night to proclaim the feast begun. They waited there to take their places up to the number of 1,000, shivering in their gorgeous clothes in the wind that tore across the hill. Kings and lesser kings and chieftains and nobles from the first down to the 5th grade, judges and soothsayers and shipwrights and poets, from the 1st grade down to the grade of 6, deer stalkers and fort builders, charioteers and champions, druids and drummers and engravers and flute players, builders and physicians and chess players, with the brooding face of Fergus at the head of these, shuffling in to crouch abstracted above his platter. When at last they were all seated in their appointed seats, and the trumpets died on the wind, Leary came with a fresh fanfare to take his place, brilliant with all the splendor of his kingship, the sheen of gold about his neck and wrists, and banded in the dark thickness of his long red hair. His queen beside him looked pale and troubled, as if she had not slept, and felt burdened by the weight of her flowing gown and the heavy gold fillet around her brow. Leary did not seem to share her anxieties. He looked forward with a great content to this feast that was properly for the festival of spring, but would be tonight for him and all Tara the celebration of the defeat of the Church of Rome. The whole gay company was light-hearted with the release from fear which they did not even understand, and talk rose like last night's thunder when the king was seated, battering back and forth across the laden tables as the servants scuttled from the kitchens with great steaming platters, and the red wine and gold mead flowed into goblets that were emptied almost in the moment they were filled. The roar of conversation and the plagnant music of the harps and flutes poured out with a light into the dark night outside, drowning all sound of anyone who might be approaching along the hill. So it was that at the height of the feast Patrick came unnoticed and stood beside the keeper of the door. When he turned and saw the dead Roman standing in silence in the candle glow, with the light on the pale silks of his cope and shining from his forehead, he could do nothing more than open and close his terrified mouth and cling to the door pillars for support. For his stricken knees at his side, the guardian warriors leaned petrified on their spears and forgot to bar the way. He was in the middle of the common hall before he was noticed, and then conversation died on gasps of terror until all dawn, the 700 feet of my Corda, there was no sound save the whisper of startled feet in the rushes and the small clatter of a spilt goblet or a dropped platter. Lucrin, now chief among the Druids, rose halfway to his feet as if he had the strength to rise no further, and his face was pale and waxen as that of Lacrew in the moment of his death. But from out of all the 1,000 guests, only one man stood up to do him honor. From the same exalted table as Lucran, the chief poet of Erin alone came to his feet and looked in silence at Patrick along the dumbfounded heads, with his hands crossed in submission and respect. Patrick looked back at him and blessed him, and silently thanked his God for his first convert on the hill of Tara. Then he turned toward the king. Leary recovered himself more quickly than either his Druids or his guest. "We did not expect you, O Roman," he cried across the silent hall, and Patrick's eyes gleamed a moment, knowing why. "But now you are come," went on Leary. "Sit with us and share our feast, you and your companions. Stewards, seat our guests." The stewards ran here and there and fussed through the hall until all were seated accordingly to their dignity and rank. Patrick came serenely and took his place close beside the king, and while the remainder of the long meal lasted, they spoke nothing to each other except formal words of empty courtesy. watched by a restless and anxious Lucron from across the room. But on the cleared tables, when the food was swept away, Leary banged his fists against the noise of the harps and flutes and the squeals of the tumbling clowns, and shouted for Lucron. "Come, Druid," he said, "and sit close beside me here with this Roman, and let me hear your dispute. Set yourselves here, one against the other, and argue out your gods. Let me listen." Through the long hours of the hot, noisy night, they disputed before Leary against the background uproar of the feast, Lucron in ferocity and anger, and more than a little of the fury of fear, Patrick, serene and determined, stating quietly and incontestable truths of his faith. It was the cold, dark hour that waits on the dawn when Leary at last yawned hugely and stood up, giving the signal that the feast was at an end. "Words, words, words," he said to the two before him. Let me see more than words. Let me see which is stronger by signs of happenings, the magic of the Druid or the faith of the Christian. For you tell us, Roman, that nothing that you do is done by magic." Patrick begged his god to help him see whatever weapons he might lay ready to his hand. Outside Mycordia, the air was bitter still, but softened with a new dampness, and the first few flakes of snow feathered the black sky, drifting through the blaze of light beyond the doors. Immediately, Lucron threw up his arms and raised his crested head to the sky. "This is our God," he cried. "This is the power of the elements that brings for us the black wind from the north, laden with snow in the days of the spring. The winds are our servants, O Roman, and will do as we bid them." With wide-flung arms, he howled his incantations into the darkness to the north wind, and the lesser Druids gathered around and joined him, with the lights of Mycorta behind them, and the people pouring out in order as they had gone in from the 14 open doors. The priest and his companions waited quietly and patiently until, at last, he stopped. "Now," Lucron said, dropping his arms and turning to Patrick, and the light from the hall shone in the heavy sweat on his face. So fierce had been his pleadings with the spirit of the weather. "Now, in this season of spring, I have bidden the black wind of the north to cover all the plain with snow up to the depth of a man's boot." Patrick looked unimpressed. With one sniff at the wind and a glance at the low-hung weight of the dark sky, he could have promised such a thing himself and thought it reasonable. But the massed watching people moved and muttered in awe and admiration, whispering together that it would take the Roman a great deal to better this. All the Roman did, however, was to express his unbounded admiration for the powers of Lucron, and then he turned away to his guest house, saying that he would sleep now and see the snow for himself when it was light. When he came back, it was late morning, and the snow was as high as a man's boot and no longer falling. He and his household had gathered up the hems of their robes to plow through it up to the crest of the hill, where the triumphant Lucron waited for him, and with him a watchful Leary and his queen. "See for yourself, then, Roman." The Druid almost spat at him. "See for yourself my power over the elements. Why should we consider this timorous god of yours when the world itself is ours? Alone I have done this, in the season foreign to snow. Could you do it, O Roman?" Patrick looked at him pleasantly. "Alone I could not do it. Without the help of my loving God I can do nothing. Now, friend Lucron, prove your power to me a little more. You have brought the snow, you say, alone and by your own powers. Now with these same powers, let me see you make it go away." There was a furious, astounded silence, and they glared at him and glared at each other and looked to Lucron for a lead when he could not give it. In the group of nobles behind the king, Lebron gave a sudden gulp of laughter and then clapped his hands to his mouth and pretended a fit of coughing. And Keon turned and looked at him in sharp surprise and not a little pleasure. By evening, the snow was there still, lying white, unmelting all across the plain. strange and improbable under the young leaves and the greening hedges. After many hours, the Druids had retired, surely and defeated, into their own wrath, having failed to move the snow by any rite or ceremony or incantation which they could devise. "And can you do it?" Lucron had yelled at Patrick in the end, almost dancing in front of him, his round, fleshy face alive with hate and malice. "Can you do it, priest of Rome?" Patrick's pleasantness was unfailing. "When my God wills," he said amiably, and retired once more behind his own walls. Lebrun was still laughing to himself when he reached his own homestead in the evening. I cannot but have respect for this Roman," he said. "He is clever and intelligent and keeps his temper, using his brains against the power-mad Lucron, and he may well defeat him yet." Maha listened to him, and her heart lifted to hear him speak so of Patrick, but she was careful now, lest she antagonize him again. "My father," she asked gently, "why did you tell me he was dead?" "Because I thought he was, daughter, and so did Lucron, and indeed all Tara, until he appeared like a spirit in the middle of my corda, with none seeing him come. Lucron, in a moment of anger, let slip that he had sent a cup of poisoned wine." "Oh," cried Maha, and clapped her fingers to her mouth. "What is it, daughter?" She told them how she and Bennett had found the frozen wine, and they were so interested in what she said that they failed to notice that she had gone to the guest house against their wishes. "So," cried her father, "the wine froze and the drop of poison did not, and he could separate the two. I admire him, he thinks the Roman, and for this I admire him." Maha seized on what she thought to be a good moment. "Well, my father, if he is not such an evil man, can I not go and see him and listen to him speak? Must I stay shut within the wrath all the days he is here? Please, my father, please." Lebrun looked down at the pale, unhappy face and found it difficult to forbid her anything. But in spite of his growing approval of the Roman, who had struck a chord of intellect in him, his daughter was to marry Keon. He could not take the chance, until this was safely done, of allowing her to come again with the influence of this clever and endearing priest, to whom he admitted, even himself, increasingly drawn. "No, my daughter," he said firmly, "no. It will be as I have ordered. You will not leave the wrath while the Roman is on Tara, no matter what I have come to think of him." Hopelessly, she turned away and left them. If she could not see him, she did not wish to hear about him, thickening her loneliness and indecision. All she could tell herself now was that she could not help it, and if she had forsaken God, it was not of her own doing. Up on the snow-covered hill, darkness was falling, but Patrick still sat on a stool in the bitter cold outside the door of the guest house, nor would he move inside for a moment even to eat. Comyn came again to plead with him as it grew dark. "My father, come to the fire. You will take a fever in this bitter cold." Patrick looked at him and laughed. "I took no fevers, Comyn, on the hill of Slemish, and many a nights I spent there with my sheep in the winters, far more cold than this. No, my friend, I thank you for your care, but I must stay here and watch the night. It is magic at the moment that is needed to win them, and I must provide it. This is another weapon in the battle for their souls, and I cannot allow it to escape me. But take the boy." He laid a hand on Bennett, who shivered beside him on the in the bitter wind, and reluctantly the boy left him and went inside with Comyn. It was in the first gray light of morning, with the sky still hanging dark above the white expanse of the plain, that he stood up suddenly and called his company. "Go, Comyn," said Patrick, and his voice was taut with urgency. "Go and bid Lucron and his druids join me on the crest of the hill. The king also, if he will come, and all the people you can rouse. Go quickly." He himself walked the trodden snow up to the crest, filling the silent dawn with the hollow booming of his bell, and by the time Lucron and his followers had arrived, and then Leary and his court, a large crowd had gathered in the gray light, uncombed and sleepy, gathering their cloaks around them against the bitter cold. Patrick looked over them all. Can they not smell it themselves, he thought, amazed, especially the Druids, who set so much store upon their knowledge of the weather. The change of wind, creeping steadily around in this last hour, so that at any moment there would be the first gust of warm, wet wind from the southwest, probably bringing the sun, but at least at this time of year bringing a quick and certain thaw. Can they not feel it themselves? He thought again, and thanked God for their simplicity, through which they could be led to him. He stood above them, and in their listening silence cried aloud to them all. In the name of God, he cried, I will clear the snow, which your Druids have failed to do. Even as he spoke, he could feel the warm spring wind freshening on his cheek, and he lifted his hand and blessed the plain, for was it not about to do God's work for him? Then he turned again to the gaping crowd. I will go now and pray to my God, he said, and in a while I will come back to you, and we will see if I have succeeded where the Druids have failed. He passed several hours in prayer and quietness, begging the help of his unfailing and generous God. And by the time he came back and stood once more before the people on the crest of the hill, the soft, moist wind was blustering fiercely over the land, clearing the sky to a serene and tender blue, and patching the white fields already with melted stretches of young green grass. Almost every person on the hill stood staring at the sky and the clearing plain and the thatched roofs steaming in the sun and muttering together in awe and consternation. When Patrick appeared, they fell silent, their eyes resting on him with fear and wonder on all their faces. Into this silence came Leary, followed by his train of angry and defeated Druids. And like his people, he stood and looked long at clear blue sky and the snow vanishing from the plain. Then he turned and faced the priest, and his narrow, intelligent eyes were crinkled with amusement, tempered with respect. Patrick met his gaze straight and steadfast and did not waver. He knew in that instant that the High King understood well what he was doing, and regarded the contest with the Druids as one of brains and not of magic. Beside him, Lebrun's face echoed the same expression, his eyes warm and amused but respectful on the Roman. At last Leary spoke, looking from Patrick's imperturbable face to the sullen, heavy scowl of Lucron. He waved a ringed hand at the fast vanishing snow on the plain. I am moved to think, he said, and his voice was tart and dry, that all this could have occurred with little help from either of you. I seem to remember that I have seen snow before, and seen it vanish also in the sudden sun of spring. I am not as simple as my poor people. Lebrun's face split into a smile, and though against his will, and he watched Patrick with deep interest for his answer, as did the High King. But it was Lucron who answered, pointing his wand at Patrick with a hand that shook with anger and menace. True, true, O King, as far as the Roman is concerned. I brought the snow, O Leary, but he could not clear it until it went of its own accord. But I, Lucron, with the strength and wonder of magic, brought it on the plain in all the warmth of spring. It is I who have proved the Roman false. Tell the people, O King. Leary did not move to do so. With his eyes still on Patrick, he asked that they would show him some sign which would be a definite answer. I will do anything you wish, O King, said Patrick, and begged for his God to help him to give some sign that this clever and clear-sighted king might be willing to accept. He felt that Leary had respect for him and wavered to his side, but that he needed one more definite sign to confirm his mind. Leary himself had an idea. Go down, he said, to the well of the calf and cast in both your holy books. See which of them will come out undamaged, protected by your faith. No, cried Lucron, before Patrick had time to even consider it. And why not? Leary's eyes were fierce on the Druid. Because water is one of this man's gods. I have heard tell that when people are moved to his faith, he takes them to a well and pours water on their heads. He has control over the spirit of the water, and could do as he wished with my holy book. Patrick's company looked at each other and smiled at this Druid tale of baptism, And beside the priest, Bennett broke out into his clear, easy laugh. Lucron glared at him. "I would engage you, Roman," he said to Patrick, "in a trial of fire. Let us cast our book into the flames, and we will see which one will be preserved." While he stood there so easy and tranquil, leaning on his crook and listening to all that passed, Patrick had been thinking fiercely, and every thought tied with a prayer for help. This moment was his last chance. He must win Leary now or never. He must gain his support for the freedom of his land, or he might as well walk off Tara now, and out of the land of Erin, and leave it to its mouthing druids. Nothing was too great to stake on this. He turned his face and stood a long moment considering the strength and steadiness of the spring wind on his face, and then he turned back at last to Lucron. "I accept your challenge, Druid," he said calmly, "but I challenge you with more than a holy book at stake in the flames." "What then?" asked Lucron suspiciously. Patrick took a deep breath and trusted himself and all he was about to do to God's hands. "We will build a small house," he said, and lifted his clear, commanding voice so that it encompassed all the people on the hill. "Half of it shall be built in green branches, still wet from the days of snow, and the other half shall be built of dry timber from the timber store." He paused, and there was no sound over the curious crowd, but the rush and tinkle of melting snow, and the wild, delirious singing of the birds who had been given back their spring. "In the dry half," he continued, "I will go myself, and I will wear the cloak of a druid. In the wet half you will go yourself wearing the cloak of my bishopric, that we may be well confused. Let us then have the hut fired at the center and see whose gods will give them protection." Lucron glared at him a long time and did not speak. "I do not trust you," he said then. "If it is you, you will take some advantage. Let it be someone else." He glared around, seeking whom Patrick might value most, and his eyes fell on Bennett. "Put in the child," he cried triumphantly. "Put in the child, and I accept your challenge." Patrick bent his head. "It is as you say," he said. Lucron laughed as if he thought him touched, and even Lebrun and the king looked doubtful, glancing at the boy beside the priest. "I will sit there," shouted Lucron, "and listen to the boy screaming as he roasts." For one moment, Bennett looked up at Patrick anxiously, and the priest, without looking down at him, laid a hand on his shoulder. It was enough for Bennett, telling him not to fear, and his handsome face resumed its normal tranquility. Let us build," cried Lucron, who could not get quickly enough to the business of the final defeat of this upstart Roman. "You may tell them how to build it," he laughed, a high, excited laugh. "It will be the last thing you will do on Tara." The crowd was gathering closer and closer, and no one moved to hold them back, all eyes on the small structure that was being rushed up in the open space before the king. Lebrun looked troubled, and the face of the king was creased with doubt. Patrick bade the men build the hut with its dry end facing to the wind, and all the time he was alert to every change in the air that blew, now strong and fierce, over the top of the hill. Winds at this time of year could be changeable and gusty, and one swift veering at the wrong moment could bring him disaster. Silently, as he watched and ordered and directed, he begged help from the only one who could bring it to him here. In a little while, the hut was ready, and Lucron was almost capering with pleasure and anticipation. He pulled off his striped cloak and draped it around Bennett's shoulders, cackling with amusement at the small figure dwarfed and weighted down by the heavy trailing garment. "Good grave clothes for you, boy," he said. "Good grave clothes." Bennett only smiled and kept his eyes on Patrick while Comyn came and lifted off the pale, heavy, silken cope, and with a look of fine distaste laid it at the arm's length on the druid's back. "Bennett, my son," said Patrick, then quietly, "you will do this for me?" "For you, my father, and for God." "That is good. Put your faith in him, and we have not any reason, either of us, to be afraid. If there is any danger to you, I will get you out, but I have faith in my helpful God, who will not leave us in this moment. When first the hut is kindled, it may be that burning fragments will fall on you from the roof. Beat them out at once, and do not fear. That is all that should happen. Lucron could not wait. He saw the overthrow of this presumptuous Roman immediate to his hands. "Come, boy, why do we delay? Are you afraid?" Bennett only smiled again, and Patrick blessed him. As he turned to go into the hut, his eye was caught by a sudden commotion in the edges of the crowd. Down in the wrath of Lebron, word had crept about that there were strange acts of mystery and magic going up on the hill between the Roman and the Druids. Maha watched the bondmaid, who sat with her, listening with widening eyes and open mouth to the whispering tale of another who had rushed in off the hill. Guiltily, the girl looked at Maha and then made some excuse, and Maha leapt to watch them from the high windows of her Grianan, pelting off along the paths of the wrath as fast as they could run. There was not another soul in sight, as if suddenly the whole busy wrath were peopled by the death. Quickly she seized her cloak and made off after the two girls, expecting at every moment to be stopped because her father had made his orders clear to all the household. But the household had fled like everybody else to the hill crest of the hill of Tara and the duel between the Roman and the Druids. The small wicket in the big gate stood open, and there was no one there to guard it. Maha picked up her blue skirts and ran full pelt like everybody else toward the top of the hill, no longer concerned about disobeying her father. With the gatekeeper gone, she was the very least of it. On all sides of her, people were running too. Those too busy or too indifferent to have gone before were hurrying now on the rumor that had crept down to them from the hill above. The Roman was about to burn the young boy who was one of his followers. At the crest of the hill, the crowd was solid. Blindly, she fought her way through the crowd, pinching, biting, pushing, and using every measure she could think of to part the dense thickness of people and let her to the front. But when she burst out at last at the front edge of the circle, she had no breath to speak. All the bitter battle of the way up, she had been terrified for Bennett, puzzling in blind misery as she fought her way along, as to why the gentle Patrick, who so loved the boy, should do this thing. Even as her disheveled head thrust itself through the last pair of elbows, she saw her fears needless, and knew that she could save what little breath she had. Bennett was in no danger. Whatever Patrick was doing with him, she knew at once that it was nothing harmful. They moved side by side toward a small, strange hut made half of fresh green branches and half of dry wood, like any other house. On her beloved Bennett's face there was the customary smile of sweet confidence with which he approached all the concern of his father and God. Her noisy arrival at the crowd's edge attracted his attention just as he was about to step into the hut, and he turned and saw her. Then, in this last moment, his smile was for her alone. Peace took her, and in the wondering, fearful crowd, she stood as quiet and tranquil as Bennett himself, waiting for what might come. Lucron was first into the hut, twitching at Patrick's cope of creamy silk, his heavy face self-satisfied and certain of his victory. Behind Bennett, on the dry end, Patrick closed the door, and immediately the boy began to sing all the hymns and psalms he knew to praise his Lord who would protect him through this ordeal. Sweet and true and peaceful, like the blackbirds in the budding trees, the boy's voice floated out over the crowd, and with one last considering cheek turned toward the wind, Patrick reached out and took a blazing torch from the hands of Comyn. "Is there just a man here," he cried, "who will light this fairly in the middle and take no side?" The vast crowd was frozen as if death had taken them where they stood, eyes rooted on the torch in the priest's hand, and there was no sound but Bennett's singing and the soft rushing of the spring wind. Then the High King turned abruptly and made a sign to Lebron, who stepped forward as calmly as he would step into the seat of judgment, and took the brand from Patrick's hand. So Maha's astonished eyes saw the hand of her father lay the torch against the middle of the hut, where the wet branches joined the dry. A moment, and the dry wood flared, and the gasp of people rose with the first spurt of scarlet flame. Then the wind took it, whipping the kindled flame along the roof and into the tangle of the wet greenery, fanning it to a strength that could not spurt to flame in the damp wood. Smoke poured in gray, pungent clouds through the side of the hut where Lucron sat, and the flames died on the dry end of the roof. Bennett coughed a little and sang on, and the wild gusts of boisterous wind tried again and again to kindle the flame, but only succeeded in making more clouds and clouds of suffocating smoke. All carried as Patrick had foreseen, away from Bennett and through the other half of the hut. There was no sound from Lucron, only on the other side the slightly hoarse but clear and happy singing of the boy. Leary watched in silence, immobile, his thumbs stuck in his girdle and behind him. Lucron's minions stared, cowed and bewildered, and did not move to help him. Lebrun's face creased a little with pity. He dropped the smoking brand still in his hand and moved a little closer to the king. "Leary, my cousin," he said, "should we not save the Druid? The Roman has made his point." Leary did not move. "Let it be as it is," he said. "Let it be as it is. The Druid took the challenge and did not think beyond that. Now let him make the payment." Slowly the pouring clouds of smoke were dying away. The green wood, too wet even for a wild wind to kindle, and when at last it was the merest whisper spiraling from the shriveled branches, Patrick moved forward and opened the door on the dry side that stood intact. Bennett ceased his singing and came out. He was unharmed and unmarked, his face a little blackened by the gusts of smoke, but the Druid's cloak, which lay around his shoulders, was burnt in many places, and the smell of scorched wool was sharp and acrid on the clear air. Patrick took him by the hand and led him toward Leary, and then turned him to the people. "Here is the hostage I gave to my God," he cried, and the clear, beautiful voice rang in triumph and thanksgiving over all the hill. "My generous God has given him back to me unharmed." He turned to the Druids. "Show the people now," he said, "the hostage which you placed there for your faith." They huddled together and looked at each other, unwilling to bring into the open the thing that they knew they would find on the other end of the hut. "You took the challenge," barked Leary in the end. "Show us your proof of power." They all moved together then, cowed and shamefaced, to drag out the poor suffocated heap of clothing that was Lucron, his smoke-grimmed face purple and twisted with the struggles of his death. The silken coat blackened but unharmed around his body. The crowd made no sound, only something like a long, wordless sigh seemed to escape them, and all their eyes rested on Patrick. Leary turned to him as they dragged away the dead Lucron. "It is enough, Roman," he cried for all to hear. "It is enough. You are wise and clever, and will not lead my people far astray. They are simple, led to you easily by signs and portents which they do not understand, and now they will listen to your teaching. I am not so simple, Roman, and while I give you my permission and my protection to preach your faith in all my land and kingdom, I bid you at the same time not to trouble me with your God. I will die with the beliefs I have lived with." He turned and looked with strange gentleness at his wife who stood beyond him. "You have taken my queen," he cried. "Now, O Roman, take my people, but do not trouble me." Patrick's heart was sick with joy, brimming and gratitude to his unfailing God. The battle over and the victory won, he turned from Leary to the great crowd on the hill, and never in all the days of his preaching did the happiness of his faith so pour out in his beautiful voice as it did over the multitude on Tara. Words flowed out of him perfectly and unsought as he told them clearly and simply of the God he brought to them, of his life and his death, and his eternal love for every single one of them. He took the things that they had always known in the shape of their beliefs, the colored winds and the sun and the pale moon, but beyond the crystal shell of the sky. He told them how all these things were but the gifts of God. "God whom we announce," he said, and his voice was like a bell that pealed above their heads, "is the ruler of all things. He gives life to all. He upholds all. He gives light to the sun. He imparts splendor to the moon. His Son is co-equal and co-eternal with himself, and the Holy Ghost from them proceeds. He looked at the faces that had drawn close to him and saw them blank and puzzled, not understanding. Their king spoke truth, he thought. They are a simple people. How can I tell them? He looked down in thought and almost in despair to the ground under his feet and saw beside them a patch of the small green creeping plant which grew all over the moist, cool land of Aaron. What better to tell them with than the tiny plant of their own green country? With a cluster of shamrocks in his hand, he lifted up his head again and bade them to see how a small plant with 3 leaves were supported on one stalk, and yet were all one leaf. So on the high crest of the sacred hill of Terah, he saw the light dawning in the puzzled faces, and brought the people to the understanding of the Holy Trinity. In the end, his voice was raw with hours of talking, his face gray with weariness, and the small shamrocks wilted in his hand. But the Christian fire had been kindled now on the Druid Hill itself, and would spread its message to all the land, and he was well content. His followers made a circle around him and led him away to rest, keeping off the people who would now have crowded to follow him everywhere he might walk. In the moving throng, Maha struggled to come up with him. If she could even reach Bennett, he would be able to get her close. But they were all swallowed up by the press of people, determined to follow the priest as far as they might. Only when they realized that they could go no further did they turn away, and the crowds thin out. Maha by then could get no further than outside of the high door of the guest house, firmly closed against all comers, so that the exhausted Patrick might find rest in peace. She stood and laid her baffled head against the cool, rough wood. Sitting there below him on the hill, she had felt the same enchantment that had led her from the dun of Seshnon, and her promise to follow his God had come up clear and true in her mind, renewed by listening again to the truths she had come steadfastly to believe. But now, whether she would or not, the greater part of her mind was given over to Kion with secret pleasure and delight, and she knew that to marry him was the desire of her own heart as well as her father's will. Most desperately, she had wanted to see the priest again, to tell him of her muddled mind and ask him what was right for her to do. Her father's steward found her there outside the door, sent to search for her when she was found missing, in company with most of the household. To her surprise, her father did not scold her for running out. He seemed quiet and abstracted, as he often was if he had had a great problem of law to solve. And her mother, too, sat and stared into the fire as if she saw there things which she had never seen before. Maha left them in their quietness and went on into the Grianan, her mother lifting her head to tell her half-heartedly to braid her hair and tidy herself, tumbled and disheveled as she was from her fighting through the crowds. She sat when she was finished at the window of her Grianan, and the sound of steps on the ladder of the Grianan did not disturb her or make her lift her tired and troubled head from where she rested it on the wooden frame. She thought it was her bondmaid come to kindle the evening lamps, but the woman made no sound and bore no light, and in the end Maha turned. In the gentle shadows, his head reaching almost to the painted ceiling, Kion stood within the curtains of her door. She could find no strength to move. She gaped and stammered and tried to say all the things she knew to be proper, such that he should not come here unattended, nor should she entertain him in any case before their wedding day. All she could manage was to open her mouth in silence, and the sweet weakness that overwhelmed her whenever she saw him was so multiplied by his closeness that she seemed almost to swim away and watch her dumb self from some painful distance. "It is well," said Kion kindly, and smiled at her, and she collected herself enough to notice the great happiness of his face. "I have spoken with your parents, and they thought that I might come and talk with you alone." Still she could not answer. "May I not sit down, little red one?" he asked, then gently, and at last she mustered her manners and stood up to make him welcome, offering the best padded stool to sit on. She sat down opposite him then, her eyes as big as saucers on his face. Keon, in his turn, felt his splendid athlete's body grown suddenly monstrous and unwielding, too huge to put safely anywhere in this painted woman's room, gigantic against the frail looks of the slight girl beside him. Maha saw no ungainly monster. She saw Keon of the Crimson Cup, with his long, fair hair new-brushed and shining like the evening sun, and the last light gleaming in his champion's collar and the gold bracelets on his wrist. His cloak was royal blue, thick with embroidery over the pleated saffron-lined linen of his fresh tunic. She thought she had never seen him look so splendid. She blinked and wondered if he might vanish like a dream. He did not vanish. He would have been happier on the battlefield, but this he had to do for Maha's happiness, and he faced it like a warrior, looking down first for courage at his huge skin shoes planted in the rushes. Maha, he said, and she started at her name as if she had never heard it before. I know that you are troubled about our marriage, since you made a promise to yourself to follow the God of Patrick. This is true? He stopped, and she nodded dumbly, big tawny eyes still fixed on his face. They allowed me for a while to speak with Patrick, he said, and we talked together of all of this. His contentment blazed in his face, and for the first time she saw the love and gentleness in his blue eyes that rested on her and dropped her own in sudden shyness. He bids me tell you, Keon went on, that you do not have to follow him in person in order that you may follow his God. I have asked him if I may be baptized as a Christian, and you also. We would marry my Maha as Christians, so that all our life, he said, would be a following of God, and you have no need of broken vows. This, I promise you, is true. At last she found her voice, hoarse and difficult. You have told these things to my parents? I have. They are content, nor do I think that they will be long in doing the same thing. Your father respects a strong and honest man, and now he will listen to Patrick. Maha sat a long time in silence, looking out past him to the sky that darkened to purple dusk, thinking over all he had said, and letting the melting happiness pour through her bones. Keon watched it growing on her face in the last light, and knew that when he had waited for her all his life, there was no need to hurry her now for her answer. At last she turned back and looked at him, and the soft freckled face broke into a smile of pure happiness, but the shadows could not hide the light of mischief in the tawny eyes. She lifted a hand and pulled sharply at one of his long, fair curls. You used, she said happily. You get very angry when I did that. You used to, she said, to get very angry when I did that. The end.